You need societies which are tolerant of people who have crazy ideas. Out of 100 crazy ideas, 99 of them are going to be completely useless by, crazy ideas thought of by crackpots which would never work. And the one will change the world, but you don't know which one. So it's a culture of pluralism, tolerance, and non-conformism that really matters. One of the things that seems to be hardwired in us for reasons that I'm not sure about is the huge respect for the thought and knowledge of earlier generations. I can easily see in 10 years Microsoft going the way that Kodak and Polaroid and Xerox went. One of the things that the internet age and modern capitalism has done, it has actually brought back the sort of single entrepreneur as a major player in the evolution of capitalism. Go back a little bit back to history. To my way of thinking, that is one of the things that explains the, uniqueness of the European experience. It's not that Christianity was better than Islam or Confucianism or Hindu. That's nonsense. Nor is it, of course, needless to say, I don't even have to add that there's nothing about being sort of white Caucasians that gives anybody an advantage. God help me. That's complete rubbish. But what is true, and this is quite unusual, is that in Europe, nonconformism and pluralism became more and more acceptable. Now, you wouldn't think so, because you all learned in school about Galileo standing trial, for coming up with the new ideas, and, if you dig deeper into the detail, you can read all. But in fact, I think after Galileo, at some point, maybe a century and a half before the Industrial Revolution, essentially everybody said, all right, fine, let's just forget about this. Let people think whatever they think. And you get more and more people writing books that annoy others. But basically, as Voltaire said, everything that you say, ticks me off to no end, but I will fight to the death to let you say it. And you get this pluralism, and you get this sort of willingness to tolerate crackpots and eccentric people. Every once in a while, one of them turns out to be Isaac Newton, but you just don't know who it's going to be. Can
I ask you this? Every society, I think you've said this fairly bluntly. You said you just need 5%, right? Roughly.
I don't know what the number is, but it's low.
X
yes.
number, but a small number, right?
Small number.
Right now, so maybe it's 1 in 100, maybe it's 1 in 1,000.
Who knows? Yeah.
Just this, what you call, I think, the intellectual elite or the upper tail, different terms for it. But you say it's just a few people that you need to do that. Now, you look at any society today, whether it's a democratically governed society, more authoritarian, you have an education system that's a very, monotonous one, or one that is very creative. You find that at that age, at the age of kids, you find that there's always a few kids who are like that, right? I see that with my nephews, nieces, kids. I see it today also, and I remember it from my time as well. I don't know if you do. So it's always that. It's almost like that's inherently there in any society. That kind of creativity, that kind of crackpotted sort of behavior that sometimes will yield amazing inventions. Question is, what prevents that 5% of kids that I believe exist in every country when the children are young? What prevents them? Is it just the political system? Is it the educational system? Is it the values? And if it is a bunch of these things, then how do you begin to start to change this culture of growth, as you've called it also?
Well,
how do you start to change it? What starts to kickstart that change?
It's hard, because in some ways you need to change the culture, and you need to. It took Europe hundreds of years to essentially adopt these ideas, which I associate primarily with the 18th century Enlightenment. But even in Europe, there have been major steps backward, not just in Russia, but in Germany, in Italy, and other places that, in which authoritarian regimes emerged and basically started to take away the freedom to think and force a particular way of thinking about the population. And basically, anybody who spoke or wrote against it, took a very significant risk and eventually had to flee. And that's, of course, what happened in these countries. And it's happening in China. I mean, you look at the universities in the United States today, I mean, God, there are huge numbers of Asian students and now more and more Russians who are running away from these sort of oppressive authoritarian regime. So what you need first and foremost, and there I think Adam Smith and his followers are absolutely right. You need something which I think of as sort of pluralism. You need the willingness to allow people to say things that you disagree with or that go against the main way of thinking, and that turns out to be a major step that many societies were not able to take, because one of the things that seems to be hardwired in us for reasons that I'm not sure about is the huge respect for the thought and knowledge of earlier generations. So we always think about the classic, and then what happens in Europe to everybody's amazement, and I'm still looking at this 400 years later, and I'm still amazed by this. You start seeing a bunch of people, not a lot, a small percentage of the population, who basically says, wait a minute, this stuff is nonsense. And the people who wrote this, may be good in their own time, but we know much better. And all of a sudden, this whole thing starts falling apart. Aristotle, the great canon, the great writer that everybody thought knew everything. It turns out that they have a whole bunch of writers in the 16th and 17th century who basically say, this guy, is full of it. It's wrong. He said this, he said that. I can prove it's wrong. And then comes Spinoza. Okay, and he said, well, the Bible was written by people, and here are all these internal contradictions. It can't be that this is true and this is also true, because they contradict each other. And so slowly, what you see is this sort of desanctification of the knowledge of the past, and lots of things that you are born with, you have to toss out. Now, that turns out to be very difficult to do. Most societies needed to have some kind of political revolution to overthrow it. So in China, to overthrow the Neo-Confucian consensus required the revolution of 1912, and you had to get rid of the whole system, and we know what happened. And they within their own time, they were very smart, but they didn't know what we know, and you have to realize that is a hard thing for people to overcome. And the Europeans, for complicated reasons, basically took that step, I would say, between approximately 1450 or 1500 and, say, the death of Isaac Newton in 1727. And by that time, by the end of Newton, it became clear to everybody, hey, we know more than Aristotle and Ptolemy and Galen and all these Hipparchus and Pliny and all these famous Roman and Greek writers that we've been studying. We're not smarter in the sense of being more intelligent. We just know more. And it's that thing that made the Europeans what. And I am not convinced that this kind of freedom to basically abandon what is known by people who taught you and by your parents, and basically say, I can do better. Because, by inventing something, it's an act of rebellion and it's an act of disrespect. I write a paper in economics that proves that some paper written 20 years ago had it wrong, and I can, prove, whatever. And that's an act, of rebellion. I say, this guy is smart. I'm smarter. I know more. That's not hardwired in us. That has to be culturally infused in us. And not a lot of societies do that. And interestingly enough,
have you seen countries do this recently, make this shift recently? The Jewish example you bring up is very...
Well, Israel, I think, is a case in point. And, I know, I think the country that probably did this most dramatically is 19th century Japan. Um, and for reasons that are fairly well understood. They saw what imperialism did to other countries. They said, this ain't going to happen to us. So we're going to basically junk everything we thought we knew. And we're going now, for them, the change was basically not so much thinking outside the box, of basically moving from one box to another box, but it's then done fantastic things for them. Uh, I am quite frankly surprised that not more of it is happening, particularly in the Middle East, and that you see essentially very little technological and scientific progress happening in the Middle East. I'm surprised I don't see more of it in South America or in Africa. It's very slow moving, and if you'd asked me, I would have 40 years ago I would have predicted it would be faster. But there's a lot of inertia in most societies, and it's hard for them. Cultural change is usually very, very slow because, after all, people grow up, as you well know, and basically they are, socialized by their teachers, and they're socialized by their parents, and they're socialized by their peers, and they've all sent them the same message. It's very hard to wake up one day and say, God, this is all nonsense. I'm going to do something entirely different, particularly if society doesn't reward it. Society has to reward it. Economics teaches, above all, that people respond to incentives. And so if by thinking outside the box and coming up with something that is novel and effective, I can also become a billionaire, that increases the incentives for me. If by doing the same thing, and people are going to accuse me of black magic and, having a pact with the devil and other kind of, sort of accusations that the conservatives use, that discourages people. And so I'll either just sit quietly and do nothing, or I will pack my suitcases and go to a place where I am more welcome. And that's what a lot of people do.
Yeah, and I think you've characterized them, as you've been doing, I think, over the last 2 minutes, as innovators, like that small group of crackpots, as you were saying, those innovators. You need the incentives, as you were just saying. And then I think
absolutely
third piece you've spoken about is the diversity, tolerance, plurality.
Absolutely.
And if you think about India for a second, and I know you mentioned you're coming to India soon, so I hope we get to engage on this question even more when you're here in Delhi. But one of the things that people talk about when they talk about India is that, even from the outside, is that India is today being seen as a talent nation. India is being seen as this group of well-educated, smart, scientifically or at least technologically oriented professionals who are coming in and running the likes of Microsoft and Google, and along with Israel, India is, Indian people of Indian origin are like at the top hierarchy of Silicon Valley founders. But you look at India. Within India, one of the biggest problems from a policymaker standpoint, and even from a public intellectual any standpoint really, if you care about India, you worry that a lot of that talent, a lot of those innovators, for reasons of incentives primarily, are going out, right? Going to the Valley, going to Europe, going to companies that are just paying them much better. And it's hard to, I think today policymakers are finding it hard to reverse that process, right, of brain drain, of this talent drain. And, I talk to people, coming back to a point about R&D, I talk to people about the fact that if Indians are doing so much innovation and are doing so much, patent generation in the US and other countries, why isn't that happening here? People are the same, but they're leaving. Even the ones who are staying here, it's not that people in India are not smart. People in India, at least enough people in India are smart enough. So I comes back to the institution's point that you made. And to be honest, we see like maybe some kind of like pendulum on our diversity, tolerance, and this and that. People say, sometimes we are, leaning towards more authoritarianism or tendencies. Sometimes we are more liberal. That's okay. I think every country moves through that kind of little bit of that pendulum all the time. I don't think that we are necessarily not tolerant or not diverse as a country. So to me, the
No.
question becomes, okay, what is the missing portion that is preventing India from becoming a tech nation? Right? The difference between the way Israel is positioned today in the world is as a tech nation,
Yeah.
where you're doing R&D, you're innovating, you're coming up with innovative technologies, blah, blah, blah. In India, we are largely a supplier of talent. And going back to our factors of production conversation earlier, unfortunately, we are focused still on the labor factor of production and not on the useful knowledge generation piece.
Well, I think transitioning from one to another, and what is frustrating, of course, is it takes so long. And I think size is an issue there. Israel was very much like what you described about India today in the 1950s and 1960s. And then it slowly started to move away from a heavily agricultural or low skill uh, manufacturing sector to this sort of high tech nation, which it is. Which is now, but it took it, a good 40 and 50 years. And remember, Israel is a small place. Okay,
Yeah.
that happened. Secondly, it got, for reasons that are completely exogenous here, a huge infusion of high quality human capital when a million Russian Jews
Yeah.
migrated to Israel.
Okay.
So in that sense, it was lucky. But other countries have made that transition. South Korea has, Taiwan has, Singapore is. I mean, it's possible to make that transition. What you have to do, obviously, is ask yourself the hard question: A, why are these top of the line Indian scientists and engineers uh, going away? And secondly, how do we bring them back?
Yeah.
And I think that is a doable task, but you have to keep cre- in creating in India the kind of conditions that will allow these people, give these people a good reason to pack their suitcases and go back. My sense is, and this is obviously not true for everybody, but it's true for a lot of people, is most people who migrate would actually rather stay at home if the conditions were
Right.
appropriate. So
Correct.
a good example is Italian. So we have in my department here outside, I think 5 or 6 Italian professors. They all love Italy. They all go back to Italy, for the summer and so on. But they don't want to live in Italy because the universities in Italy don't pay, and they have a terrible system of promotion, and they're incredibly bureaucratic, and so
Right.
on and so forth. And so now, if Italy had any sense, they would make a major overhaul for the higher education system, and they would bring back maybe not all, but half the leading Italian
Yeah.
professors who are now teaching at places like the University of Chicago and Harvard and Northwestern and Berkeley. And they could bring them back if they really made the reforms. But, politics gets in the way. And my sense is that I suspect that maybe to some extent what's happening uh, in India as well. But with the right policy, you can bring back not
Bring back
everybody,
it.
but
No,
enough
yeah.
people.
And so let me
Pay
ask.
them, pay them, give them the physical plant that they need to do their work, which of course differs from area to area, and provide them with incentives in the sense that you say, look, if you do this and that, we'll let you start your own company, and then
Exactly.
eventually you can sell it on the Nasdaq, and make a fortune. That's what's happening in Israel. You look at all. I can give you 20 or 30 companies that were upon a time were startups, and now they are billion-dollar companies. And I mean, this is not an unmixed blessing, I should say, because typically these policies tend to increase inequality
That's
and therefore create political problems. In Israel, what you're looking at now, I mean, behind the facade of debates about legal reform and so on, what you really see is growing inequality, and the
yeah.
people who are who, on the one side of the area, people who benefited from the high tech economy, and on the other part, you see people who did not, and that's
Yeah.
going to be the case. That's going to be the case everywhere.
No,
I mean,
that's
it's not an unmixed blessing, but it does, it does raise, as you started off with, it is the key to becoming prosperous.
No, and Europe, I mean, you look at pre-World War One Europe, you see similar levels of inequality arising from the phenomenon of industrial capitalism. Right today,
Absolutely.
tech, the tech economy is in many ways creating similar levels, if even greater levels of inequality. And much like we see the rise of, welfare states in Europe and labor movements and socialist movements, and all of them then just, merge and become, the potent mix that leads to maybe even wars, right? We have to be very mindful today as well with these rising levels of inequality. I absolutely agree with you. And, and now on that point, I think that's a good segue to ask you, given useful knowledge is, the one key takeaway you've shared, that's critical here. The rise of artificial intelligence, we started talking about that a little while ago, seems to, on the surface right now, be heralding a complete, revolution in the access to knowledge, right?
Absolutely.
The access to data, the access to information, and the ability to build on it. If the Gutenberg press leads to, in some way, shape, or form to the, the Renaissance and this piece that you talked about in Europe, to me, artificial intelligence and these large language models and this ability to do machine learning and data analytics, where the technology is learning how to become better on its own, much like you were saying, right? Technology is self-reinforcing. To me, it sounds like we are on the throes of a massive revolution, economically at least. But I wanted to get your sense that you've studied the Industrial Revolution, you've studied history. Is this hype, you feel, generated by certain Silicon Valley companies? Or
No.
do you think there's more to it? And if it is, what's your sense of what it will mean for us in the next 5 to 10?
Well, I think we have already experienced a large chunk of the information revolution, and we've gotten so used to it that we don't even realize how different things are from how they used to be. I think there has been a vast democratization of access to information and to knowledge.
Absolutely.
And the constraint is right now, it's not access, it is sorting the weeds from the chaff, because information is being so accessible, there are endless opportunities for people to basically sell you, to try to put things in the public domain that are, fake in one form or another. And so one of the things that needs to be done much better is essentially putting markers of quality and believability on the stuff that this system coughs up. So, like everybody else, I've been playing with ChatGPT. Who could not? But in some sense, what people don't realize is that the fact that the ChatGPT is available to everybody, it's available just as well to me as to Warren Buffett. You don't have to be rich to access ChatGPT or to access, Facebook or Wikipedia or, a zillion things that are available. It's completely democratic. I mean, anybody can access it, and people do. And so that in and of itself, I think, is already a major step forward, that this is not confined to the elite, but it's available to everybody. Now, what artificial intelligence is going to do, I think, it is going to, and this is bad for guys like me, it's going to devalue human capital, because people without much education can now do things that you could only do if you had a PhD or at least, a higher degree. And so now, people can basically, appear as if they can write articles that are scientific and serious just by going to ChatGPT and say, write me an article about the constant elasticity of substitution production function, in the production of barley, and it will do it. Now, before that, there may be 10 people in the whole world who could do it. Now anybody can do it. I mean, that is a reduction of inequality. So I actually, what I mean, I worry about certain aspects of artificial intelligence, but I actually think that much like the internet and much like the smartphone, it's a huge equalizer. It's a huge equalizer, and certainly the smartphone has done fabulous things in places that before that just couldn't dream about. I mean, the smartphone has revolutionized Africa. People don't understand how
Yeah.
deeply African economies depend on smartphones, much more so than in the West, for instance.
Yeah.
Completely dependent on it. The same must be true in India. I haven't been there a long time, but I imagine
Or
everybody in India.
you will be
Yeah,
amazed.
basically it's so cheap that it's available to everybody. And so
Yeah.
I'm sort of in favor of that. I think that actually will change society. I mean, I can't quite envisage what the end game will look like, but in some sense, this is a positive development. Just as I think that the whole digitalization, which we've been going through since the 1950s, basically, has been a great equalizer. I mean, there was some talk once upon a time about the digital divide, that only people in urban areas had access to the internet. But by now, these things are essentially being solved. There's still a few islands where reception isn't good, but most people have access to it, and most people use it. Even people that we think of as being undereducated, undertrained, and so on. In housing developments in urban areas, but they all use smartphones. They all use how to access information, and people have become more sophisticated, more informed about lots of things that before that they were ignorant. And unfortunately, there have been opportunistic entrepreneurs who've been trying to sell them, both political and other people, but you look at people who are selling, rubbish, and almost all of them, uh, uh, use this to make money.
The interesting flip side of while I completely agree with you about the democratization of information from the internet, the smartphone to now, let's say, AI tools like ChatGPT, there's a flip side of behind the scenes story there as well, which is that if you look at the companies that are really going to generate wealth out of artificial intelligence technologies, they require massive capital expenditure. They require the best research scientists. They require the most access to data, the most access to cloud computing infrastructure. And that, unfortunately, is not accessible to entrepreneurs that easily around the world,
No,
right?
no.
So that
Yeah.
level playing field from a corporate standpoint right now doesn't exist, but from a user standpoint, absolutely. I mean, I have to make that analogy. It's like the Industrial Revolution allows everyone to start wearing clothes because the cost of textiles goes down, but the companies or the countries that make wealth, that generate wealth and prosperity out of it, very few, right?
I mean,
Personally, I
I
think
can
with
give you other
AI,
examples. You're absolutely right. You think about railroads. So
yeah,
what the railroads did is it made cheap transportation available basically to a vast bulk of the population. But the railroads companies,
that's true.
were large and monopolistic, and that's just how. And the same was true for automobiles. Henry Ford. You think about it, and yet I think now you are taking me to some different area of discussion, but I still think that under capitalism, barriers to entry are always there, and yet they're always being. You always get new entries. I mean,
Overcome.
sure, Google now is vast. I think Microsoft. I forget it was Microsoft or Amazon, but they are. These are just enormously valuable companies, and yet there still are new entries that 5 years ago we had never heard of, and now they're there. Think of TikTok. I mean, who'd ever heard of TikTok 5 years ago? Now they are vast. So, you know, so or the company that makes ChatGPT, what is it?
OpenAI.
OpenAI.
That's right.
OpenAI. So OpenAI, I mean, 3 years ago, nobody had heard of them. So, I mean, there is entry, and, sure, these companies are big, but General Motors was big once, Kodak was big once.
That's right.
Uh, Capitalism, in that sense, as it always, it exploits the economies of scale, but the barriers to entry are never
Permanent.
insuperable. You have to be a little bit. It's not going to happen from today to
Creative.
tomorrow, and 99% of the companies that try will fail, and only
Yes.
one of them will become Microsoft. Okay, but
Right.
that's just that's in some sense inevitable. That does not keep me up. I can easily see in 10 years Microsoft going the way that Kodak and Polaroid and Xerox went. They once were big and now they ain't.
No, that's right.
And
I mean, today, if you look at companies like Google, etc., they're very worried that OpenAI, ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, that on in these kind of fields, they are possibly losing out, right? So there's
they,
fear
they might well.
of being disrupted. I think it's permanent with
Yeah,
capitalism.
yeah.
That idea of
Look what
creative
happened.
destruction.
Look what happened to Twitter. I mean, in a year, Twitter won't exist. That's my
Well, it
prediction.
doesn't exist anymore. It's called X now, so Twitter
That's true. I don't think
doesn't exist
that's.
anymore.
But what I find interesting is that one of the things that the internet age and modern capitalism has done, it has actually brought back the sort of single entrepreneur as a major player in the evolution of capitalism. There was a time when we thought, Schumpeter surely thought so, and so did Alfred Chandler in a different way. They basically thought that these entrepreneurs, these sort of Andrew Carnegies and Henry Fords of this world, would be gradually taken over by bureaucrats, by boards, complete separation of ownership and control, and that essentially the role of the colorful,
Yeah,
spectacular entrepreneur. And now we look at us, and we're living in the age of Steve Jobs and Elon
Elon
Musk, and
Musk.
Bill Gates. I mean, all of those guys are. I mean, they're not all as colorful as Elon Musk, thank God. But uh,
There's only
but
that many
but
Elon you can
yeah,
take.
but the entrepreneurs are sort of making their comeback, and
Yeah,
I find, as an economic historian, I find that rather encouraging, and what that essentially means is that if that is the case, then companies that were once run by an entrepreneur, once the entrepreneur is gone from the scene for one reason or another, they may not last,
yeah,
and or they may completely change. So, the Ford Motor Company is still with us, but they're a long, long way from Henry Ford,
from the peak. Correct.
which is
No, that's
probably
right.
also. But
Yeah,
that's also probably a blessing, rather, given what a jerk Henry Ford was. But that's a different
I
story.
just read it, I just read a biography of his, and absolutely colorful character as well. In many ways.
Who's
Uh,
that?
Henry Ford. I,
Yeah,
yeah, I did not
yeah.
actually know about the
Ouch.
character Henry
Yeah.
Ford. I
Well,
I knew mostly the company and the
a mix,
a fascinating read.
a brilliant man, but not somebody who you'd want to have member of your family.
And so when you come to India, I think you'll notice that what you said is absolutely right. Now, suddenly it's the single entrepreneurs that are being completely, I would say, glorified, worshipped, and they are becoming such influencers of societal values,
Mm.
of how to deal with things in your life. That young Indians are now often following the values and the guidance being given by some of these tech entrepreneurs. So it's very
Oh
fun.
yeah.
They've become very influential figures in, I think, Indian society, not just the economy. But Professor Mokyr, I've taken up a lot of your time. This
Yeah,
is
I've had
absolutely
a wonderful time. Maybe, yeah.
fascinating
So
conversation.
maybe we should, when I come to Delhi, we can have lunch or dinner some evening and talk a
That,
bit more. It would
that
be
that
fun.
that would be amazing. That'd be my honor. I would love that. for sure. Let's make that happen for sure. Um, we do have one quick thing to do. I end every podcast episode with two quick questions for all my guests. So one is to recommend a book that you feel, and one other than your own. We'll definitely put
Oh, no.
so it has to be a book other than your own that you recommend for people who are interested in the kind of topics we've covered today to read. And second would be a guest that you would suggest that we bring on to the podcast as well in the future. So a book you recommend and a guest for the podcast. The two recommendations.
You should have warned me.
I love that you're stumped by these questions, not by
about
big
so
questions.
I will, yeah. So and then the book I will recommend is a book by Joseph Henrich. You know the book I'm talking about?
Weird people.
The Weird Book.
Yes,
I love that book. I mean, I
love it.
disagree with lots of stuff in it, but Joe Henry, I know him personally, of course, and he's a friend of mine. But what Joe really represents for me is the greatness of social science, because Joe is an anthropologist, he is an economist, he is a psychologist, and yet the book is largely about history.
Yeah.
And I think it's a fantastic book. I think it's very accessible. It makes, I think, a really important point. And so I love that book. And
Yeah.
so okay, so that's the book. Now the person that you should bring on this show, and if you haven't had him already, and there will be a fair amount of work to get him to come, but you should, is a man, I'm sure you've seen the name, is Darren Asamoah.
I'm having him next month.
God,
Really excited. And
he is a very close friend of mine, and an unbelievable intellect.
Yeah.
Endless knowledge, endless understanding. Again, we don't agree on everything, but that's what you would expect. But Darren is simply he's just a great guy. He also speaks very well. You know, he's thought about everything. And so I would second, given that you already bringing me on the show, I would second his invitation. And when he comes on your show, you can tell him that you asked me to recommend somebody, and I said Darren.
Definitely will.
Darren Asamoah. So
yeah.
Since that is I'm not, given that you have that you already have invited him, I will give you one more name.
Oh, great.
This will be more controversial, but more interesting. And this is a former graduate student of mine who teaches at George Mason University. His name is John Nye, Nye.
Okay.
And John is a brilliant man with very strong opinions, which would make him great for your program. You will disagree with him. When he was my student, we almost once came to blows. I forget what it was all about. He has very strong opinions.
Doing this virtually.
And he and I disagree about almost everything. Because he is, you talk to him and you'll see. He's extremely smart, extremely well informed, and he just is a living proof of how people who are very smart and very informed still can have a lot of crackpot beliefs, but he defends them vigorously. So write to John. If you need his email address, he's on the economics department website of George Mason University. You can find him. If you can't, let me know, and I'll send you his email address. And see if you can get him to come on this show and see what he tells you. I mean, he will. Good. Enough said. I don't want to prejudice. He's an interesting guy with eccentric views. Let's leave
No,
it at that.
perfect. That sounds like a great recommendation. I had not come across him, so I look forward
No,
to
you wouldn't.
looking him
But
up,
but I know him well.
engaging with it.
Okay, very good.
Done. Perfect. Thank
All
you
right.
so much, Professor Mokyr. This has been an absolute delight.
This is
Look forward to
okay.
continuing.
Very good. Very good. And I'll, and with some luck, we'll meet in Delhi.
No, for sure. We'll make it up. We'll make it
All
up.
right. I'll be there in December.